The veterinarians had signed the papers declaring the mare dead and turned away when 12-year-old Miguel dropped to his knees in the sawdust and begged for just 5 minutes alone with her body. What the auction house cameras recorded in those 5 minutes left everyone who watched the footage unable to speak. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty grounds of the Coleman County Livestock Auction as pickup trucks and trailers rolled in one after another. The air carried the familiar scent of hay, leather, and anticipation that marked every sale day in this small Texas town. Ranchers in worn boots and weathered cowboy hats gathered along the metal railings, exchanging nods and handshakes with neighbors they had known for decades. For most, this was simply another Saturday at the auction house, another opportunity to buy, sell, and trade the animals that formed the backbone of their livelihoods. But for 12-year-old Miguel Reyes, this day would become something he would never forget for as long as he lived. Miguel stood near the entrance of the main arena, his small frame barely visible among the crowd of adults who towered around him. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from the early morning ride to the auction, and his blue plaid shirt was already collecting dust from the arena floor. His eyes, however, were fixed on a single point across the crowded space. There, being led through the back entrance by a handler in a sweat-stained hat, was a horse that seemed to carry the weight of the world on its shoulders. The mare was a pale cream color, almost white under the harsh fluorescent lights that hung from the metal rafters above. Her coat, though dull and matted in places, still held a faint shimmer that hinted at beauty that had once been undeniable. But what struck Miguel most deeply was the look in her eyes. They were tired, defeated, like someone who had given up hope long ago. The boy felt something stir in his chest as he watched the mare being positioned in the center ring. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a booming voice and a microphone clipped to his blue shirt, began his rapid-fire chant as the bidding commenced. Miguel did not understand all the numbers being thrown around, but he understood enough to know that this horse was not attracting much interest. The ranchers around him shifted their weight impatiently, some checking their phones, others engaged in quiet conversations that had nothing to do with the animal standing before them. To them, she was just another horse past her prime, another creature whose value had diminished with age and neglect. But to Miguel, there was something else entirely, something that called to him in a way he could not explain. His grandfather, Eduardo, stood beside him with arms crossed over his chest. Eduardo was a man of few words but deep wisdom, a third-generation rancher who had spent his entire life working the land and caring for animals. He noticed the way his grandson was looking at the mare and placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. Miguel looked up at him with eyes that seemed to plead without speaking a single word. Eduardo followed his gaze back to the ring where the mare stood with her head hanging low, her spirit seemingly as broken as her body appeared. The old man sighed heavily, recognizing something in both the horse and his grandson that reminded him of himself many years ago. Without saying anything, he raised his hand just as the auctioneer was about to move on, placing a bid that caused a few heads to turn in surprise. When the gavel came down and Eduardo Reyes was declared the winner, Miguel felt his heart soar with a joy he had never experienced before. He did not care that his grandfather had paid next to nothing for the animal. He did not care that the other ranchers were shaking their heads and muttering about fools and their money. All that mattered was that this horse, this forgotten creature that no one else wanted, was coming home with them. As they made their way toward the holding pens to collect their new purchase, Miguel's mind was already racing with possibilities. He would brush her coat until it shone. He would feed her the best hay they had. He would spend every spare moment earning her trust and showing her that not all humans were the same. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. The moment they reached the holding area, Miguel noticed something was terribly wrong. The mare, who had been standing in the center ring just minutes before, was now lying on her side in the sawdust. A small crowd had gathered around her, and the voices of the handlers were rising with concern. Miguel pushed through the legs of the adults blocking his path until he reached the metal gate that separated him from the fallen horse. His breath caught in his throat when he saw her lying there motionless, her chest barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. A veterinarian who had been on site for the auction was already kneeling beside the mare, his hands moving quickly over her body as he assessed her condition. His expression grew more somber with each passing moment, and when he finally stood up and removed his gloves, the look on his face told Miguel everything he needed to know before the words were even spoken. The man approached Eduardo, who had just arrived at the scene, and spoke in a low voice that was clearly meant to be private. But Miguel heard every word. The mare's heart was failing, her body was shutting down. There was nothing more that could be done. She would be gone within the hour, likely within minutes. The veterinarian recommended they put her down immediately to spare her any further suffering. Miguel felt the world around him begin to spin. This could not be happening. Not now. Not when they had just found each other. He looked at the mare lying in the sawdust, at her eyes that were now closed, at her body that seemed so still and lifeless. And in that moment, something inside him refused to accept what he was being told. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, final and absolute. Miguel stood frozen at the gate, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the cold metal bars. Around him, the adults continued their conversation in hushed tones, discussing the logistics of disposing of an animal that had not even made it off the auction grounds. To them, this was simply an unfortunate turn of events, a minor inconvenience that would be resolved and forgotten by the end of the day. But to Miguel, it was as if someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart until it could barely beat. He had known this horse for less than an hour, yet somehow it felt like he had known her his entire life, and now they were telling him she was going to die. Eduardo watched his grandson with a mixture of concern and understanding. He had seen that look before, many years ago, in the eyes of a young boy who had lost his first calf to illness. That boy had been himself, and he remembered the pain as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. He knew there was nothing he could say that would make this easier, nothing he could do that would change the outcome. But when Miguel finally turned to look at him, the old man saw something in those young eyes that surprised him. It was not defeat. It was not acceptance. It was determination, fierce and unwavering, burning like a flame that refused to be extinguished. Miguel stepped closer to his grandfather, his voice trembling but resolute. He asked for just 5 minutes alone with the horse. That was all he wanted. 5 minutes to say goodbye, to let her know that someone cared, to make sure she did not leave this world feeling as abandoned as she had clearly felt for so long. Eduardo hesitated, knowing that what his grandson was asking was unusual, perhaps even pointless in the eyes of those around them. But he also knew that sometimes the heart sees things that the mind cannot comprehend. He nodded slowly and turned to speak with the veterinarian, who raised an eyebrow but ultimately agreed to the request. What harm could it do, after all? The animal was beyond saving. A few more minutes would not change anything. The gate swung open with a rusty creak, and Miguel stepped into the holding pen. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, losing interest now that the excitement was over. Only a few remained, watching from a distance with mild curiosity as the young boy made his way toward the motionless mare. The sawdust crunched beneath his boots, and the smell of the arena filled his nostrils with each breath. But Miguel was aware of none of it. His entire focus was on the pale form lying before him, on the gentle rise and fall of her sides that seemed to grow weaker with each passing second. He knelt down beside her, his jeans pressing into the dusty ground as he lowered himself to her level. Up close, he could see the scars and marks that told the story of a life filled with hardship. There were patches where her coat had worn thin, areas where the skin beneath showed signs of old wounds that had healed but never quite faded. Her ribs were visible beneath her hide, evidence of meals missed and care neglected. And yet, despite all of this, Miguel saw something beautiful in her. He saw strength in the way she had survived for so long. He saw courage in the way she had stood in that auction ring, facing the indifference of the crowd without flinching. And he saw hope, faint but present, in the way her ear twitched slightly as he drew near. Miguel placed his hand gently on her neck, feeling the warmth of her body beneath his palm. Her coat was rougher than he had expected, But there was something comforting about the texture, something real and solid in a moment that felt like it could shatter at any second. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from hers, and began to speak. The words came slowly at first, hesitant and uncertain, like a stream finding its way around obstacles in its path. He told her that she was not alone. He told her that someone had finally seen her, truly seen her, and that she mattered. He told her about his home, about the pastures that stretched out behind his grandfather's house, about the other horses that would have welcomed her into their herd. He painted a picture of the life she could have had, the life he had dreamed of giving her from the moment he first saw her in that ring. As he spoke, something strange began to happen. The mare's breathing, which had been growing steadily shallower, seemed to stabilize. Her ear, which had been lying flat against her head, began to perk up slightly, as if she was listening to every word he said. Miguel noticed the change but did not dare to hope. He continued speaking, his voice growing stronger and more confident as he poured out his heart to this creature who had captured his soul in the span of a single morning. The veterinarian, who had been standing near the gate checking his watch, noticed the change as well. He frowned and took a step closer, his professional curiosity piqued by what he was witnessing. Eduardo, standing beside him, watched his grandson with a mixture of pride and wonder. The boy had always had a way with animals, a gift that seemed to run in their family like blood through veins. But this was something different. This was something that defied explanation. Miguel felt the mare stir beneath his hand. Her muscles, which had been completely slack just moments before, began to tense ever so slightly. Her eyes, which had been closed since he entered the pen, began to flutter. And then, in a moment that would be replayed in his memory for the rest of his life, she opened them. Those dark, tired eyes that had seemed so defeated in the auction ring now held a spark of something new. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. And when her gaze found his, Miguel felt a connection form between them, that it was as powerful as it was inexplicable. In that moment, he made a silent promise. He would not let her go. No matter what anyone said, no matter what the odds, he would fight for her. The veterinarian pushed through the gate before anyone could stop him, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he rushed toward the mare. He had been practicing animal medicine for over 30 years, and in all that time, he had learned to trust his instincts and his training above all else. What he had just witnessed should not have been possible. He had examined this horse himself, had felt her weakening pulse beneath his fingers, had seen the telltale signs of cardiac failure that he had encountered dozens of times throughout his career. And yet here she was, eyes open, muscles tensing, showing signs of life that had not been there just minutes before. He knelt down on the opposite side of the mare from Miguel, his hands moving automatically as he began to reassess her condition. The boy watched the veterinarian work, never removing his hand from the mare's neck. He could feel her heartbeat now, stronger than before, pulsing beneath his palm like a drum that had found its rhythm after a long silence. The veterinarian's expression shifted from disbelief to confusion, to something that looked almost like wonder as he completed his examination. He sat back on his heels and removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair as he tried to make sense of what his instruments were telling him. Her heart rate had stabilized, her breathing had deepened. The signs of imminent cardiac arrest that he had observed earlier were still present, but they seemed to be receding rather than advancing. It was as if something had given this animal a reason to keep fighting. Eduardo approached slowly, his weathered face betraying none of the emotions churning beneath the surface. He had lived long enough to know that some things in this world could not be explained by science or logic. He had seen calves born during thunderstorms that should have killed them. He had watched crops survive droughts that had destroyed everything around them. And now he was watching his grandson perform what could only be described as a miracle simply by refusing to give up on a creature that everyone else had already written off. The veterinarian stood up and walked over to Eduardo, speaking in a voice low enough that Miguel could not hear. He said that he could not explain what was happening, but that the mare's condition had improved dramatically in the last few minutes. She was not out of danger, not by any means, but she was no longer on death's doorstep. It was as if she had decided to live. Miguel remained by the mare's side as the adults continued their conversation. He stroked her neck gently, whispering words of encouragement that only she could hear. He told her that she was strong, stronger than anyone knew. He told her that she had survived this long for a reason, and that reason was standing right beside her. He told her about the green pastures waiting for her at home, about the cool water of the creek that ran along the edge of their property, about the shade of the old oak tree where the other horses liked to gather on hot summer afternoons. He painted a picture of a future that was waiting for her, a future filled with kindness and care and all the things she had been denied for so long. The mare listened. There was no other way to describe it. Her ears swiveled toward him as he spoke, tracking the sound of his voice like satellites following a signal. Her eyes, still tired but now alert, watched his face with an intensity that was almost human. And when he paused to catch his breath, she let out a soft sound, somewhere between a sigh and a nicker, that seemed to say she understood. Miguel felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back. This was not the time for crying. This was the time for hope, for faith, for believing in something that everyone else said was impossible. The decision was made to transport the mare to Eduardo's ranch rather than putting her down at the auction house. The veterinarian, still shaking his head in disbelief, agreed to follow them in his truck and continue monitoring her condition. It took several men working together to coax the mare to her feet, supporting her weight as she struggled to find her balance on legs that trembled with exhaustion. Miguel walked beside her every step of the way, his hand never leaving her side, his voice a constant stream of encouragement that seemed to give her strength when her own reserves failed. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle parted before them like a sea before a ship, and more than one hardened rancher wiped something from his eye as they passed. Loading her into the trailer was another challenge entirely. The mare, weak as she was, seemed reluctant to enter the confined space. Her eyes rolled with fear, and her nostrils flared as she caught scents that clearly triggered memories of past trauma. Miguel climbed into the trailer first and stood at the far end, calling to her softly, promising her that everything would be all right. It took nearly 20 minutes of patient coaxing, but eventually she placed one tentative hoof on the ramp, then another, until she was standing inside the trailer beside the boy who had refused to let her die. Eduardo closed the door behind them and secured the latch, then climbed into the cab of his truck and started the engine. The drive home was the longest of Miguel's young life. He sat in the trailer with the mare, his back against the metal wall, her head resting in his lap. The motion of the truck caused her body to sway gently, and more than once Miguel thought he felt her strength fading again. But each time he would start talking, and each time she would respond. It was as if his voice was a lifeline, a tether that kept her anchored to this world when everything in her body was telling her to let go. By the time they pulled into the driveway of the Reyes Ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed to promise better days ahead. The mare needed a name, Miguel realized as they prepared to unload her. And in that moment, watching the sunset reflect off her pale coat, he knew exactly what to call her. He would name her Esperanza, hope. The first weeks with Esperanza were a constant battle between hope and despair. The veterinarian, whose name was Dr. Samuel Whitmore, visited the ranch every other day to monitor her condition and adjust her treatment as needed. He had been practicing medicine in Coleman County for over 3 decades, but he freely admitted that he had never seen anything quite like what had happened at the auction house that day. The mare should have died. Every medical indicator, every diagnostic tool at his disposal, had told him that her heart was failing and that there was nothing more to be done. And yet here she was, lying in a clean stall filled with fresh hay, fighting for her life with a determination that seemed to draw its strength from the young boy who rarely left her side. Miguel woke each morning before dawn, slipping out of bed while the rest of the house was still wrapped in sleep. He would make his way to the barn in the gray light of early morning, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air, and he would sit with Esperanza until the sun came up. He talked to her about everything and nothing, sharing stories from school, describing the dreams he had the night before, telling her about the future he imagined for them both. Sometimes he would read to her from the worn paperback books he kept in his room. Adventure stories about brave heroes in distant lands that seemed to transport them both beyond the wooden walls of the barn. And always he reminded her that she was loved, that she was wanted, that she had a home here for as long as she lived. Eduardo watched his grandson with a mixture of pride and concern. The boy was neglecting his other responsibilities, letting his schoolwork slide and spending every free moment in the barn. But the old man could not bring himself to intervene. He recognized what was happening between Miguel and Esperanza, recognized it because he had experienced something similar himself many years ago. When he was just a few years older than Miguel, he had nursed a sick colt back to health against all odds, and that colt had grown into the finest horse he had ever owned. Some bonds were worth sacrificing for, worth fighting for, worth believing in, even when the world told you to give up. This was one of those bonds, and Eduardo would not be the one to break it. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly and almost imperceptibly, Esperanza began to improve. Her appetite returned first, tentative nibbles at the grain Miguel offered her gradually becoming eager consumption. Then her strength began to return, her legs growing steadier beneath her as she learned to stand and walk again. Dr. Whitmore documented her progress with the meticulous attention of a scientist observing a phenomenon he could not explain. Her heart, which had been on the verge of complete failure, was healing itself in ways that defied medical understanding. He theorized that perhaps the initial diagnosis had been wrong, that perhaps he had missed something in the chaos of the auction house. But deep down, in a part of himself that he rarely acknowledged, he suspected that something else was at work here. Something that had to do with the boy who refused to leave her side. Miguel celebrated each small victory as if it were a major triumph. The first time Esperanza stood up on her own, he ran into the house to tell his grandfather with tears streaming down his face. The first time she walked across the stall without assistance, he called Dr. Whitmore at home just to share the news. And the first time she ventured out of the barn into the sunlight, stepping cautiously into the paddock as if seeing the world for the first time, Miguel felt a joy so profound that it seemed to fill every corner of his being. This was what he had dreamed of when he first saw her in that auction ring. This was the life he had promised her when she lay dying in the sawdust. And now, against all odds, it was becoming reality. But recovery was not a straight line, and there were setbacks that tested Miguel's faith to its limits. One morning, about 6 weeks after bringing Esperanza home, he arrived at the barn to find her lying on her side, her breathing shallow and labored, just as it had been that terrible day at the auction. His heart nearly stopped as he rushed to her side, calling her name, begging her to open her eyes. Doctor. Whitmore was summoned immediately, and after a tense examination, he delivered news that left Miguel feeling like he had been punched in the stomach. The mare had suffered a relapse. Her heart, which had been showing such promising signs of recovery, was struggling again. The next 24 hours would be critical. Miguel refused to leave the barn. His mother, Maria, brought him food that he barely touched, and blankets that he wrapped around himself as the temperature dropped. His father, who worked long hours at a factory in the next town and rarely involved himself in ranch matters, came to stand in the doorway of the barn and watch his son keeping vigil over the dying horse. He did not understand the bond that had formed between them, could not comprehend why his son was so devoted to an animal that had brought nothing but worry and expense into their lives. But he saw the love in Miguel's eyes, saw the determination that refused to waver even in the face of seemingly certain loss. And something in his own heart softened just a little. The night was long and cold, filled with moments when Esperanza's breathing would become so faint that Miguel was certain she was gone. Each time he would lean in close, placing his ear against her chest to listen for a heartbeat, and each time he would find it still there, weak but persistent, refusing to give up, just as he refused to give up on her. He talked to her through the darkness, his voice growing hoarse as the hours passed, telling her stories and making promises and pouring out his heart in ways he had never done with another living soul. And somewhere in the deepest part of the night, when the stars were at their brightest and the world was at its quietest, something shifted. Esperanza opened her eyes, and Miguel knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that she was going to survive. Spring arrived in Coleman County with an explosion of color and life that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place at the Reyes Ranch. The pastures that had lain dormant through the winter months erupted in waves of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, carpeting the land in shades of purple, blue, and orange that stretched as far as the eye could see. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property swelled with snowmelt from distant mountains, its waters running clear and cold over smooth stones that had been polished by centuries of flow. And in the paddock behind the barn, a pale mare walked alongside a young boy, her steps growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. Esperanza's recovery had exceeded everyone's expectations, including those of Dr. Whitmore, who had taken to calling her his miracle patient. Her coat, which had been dull and matted when she first arrived, now gleamed like polished ivory in the afternoon sun. Her ribs, once visible beneath her hide, had disappeared beneath layers of healthy muscle built through careful feeding and gentle exercise. And her eyes, those tired, defeated eyes that had first captured Miguel's attention at the auction, now sparkled with an intelligence and warmth that seemed to recognize him the moment he came into view. She was not the same horse she had been 6 months ago. She was something more, something better, something that had been forged in the fire of suffering and emerged stronger on the other side. Miguel had changed as well, though the transformation was less visible to those who did not know him well. He carried himself differently now, with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. His grades at school had improved, his teachers noting a new focus and determination in his work that they attributed to maturity, but that Miguel knew came from something deeper. Caring for Esperanza had taught him lessons that no classroom could provide. He had learned about patience, about perseverance, about the power of love to overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. He had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with fists or weapons, but with gentle words and unwavering faith. And he had learned that every living creature, no matter how broken or forgotten, has the capacity to heal when given the chance. The bond between boy and horse had become something of a legend in the small community. People would drive out of their way just to catch a glimpse of them together, walking the fence line in the early morning, or standing beneath the old oak tree as the sun set behind the distant hills. Local newspapers had run stories about the miracle mare and the boy who saved her, and more than one television station had reached out requesting interviews. Eduardo politely declined these requests on his grandson's behalf, understanding that what Miguel and Esperanza shared was too precious to be turned into a media spectacle. This was not a story for the entertainment of strangers. This was a sacred thing, a connection that deserved to be protected and nurtured away from the glare of cameras and the noise of public attention. But not everyone in Coleman County viewed the situation with such reverent eyes. There were those who saw Esperanza as nothing more than a drain on resources, an old horse with a bad heart that was consuming time and money that could be better spent elsewhere. Among these skeptics was a man named Harold Briggs, a wealthy rancher who owned several thousand acres adjacent to the Reyes property. Briggs was a man who measured the value of everything in dollars and cents, and he had long coveted the small plot of land that Eduardo's family had worked for 3 generations. He saw the attention being lavished on a worthless animal as further proof that the Reyes family lacked the business sense to properly manage their holdings, and he began making inquiries about purchasing their ranch. Eduardo dismissed these overtures without a second thought. His family had built this ranch from nothing, had poured their sweat and blood into the soil, had buried their ancestors in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the pastures. No amount of money could convince him to sell, and no amount of pressure would make him change his mind. But Briggs was not a man accustomed to hearing the word no, and when direct negotiation failed, he began exploring other avenues. He made calls to the county zoning board, questioning whether the Reyes property was in compliance with various regulations. He filed complaints about noise and odors that did not exist, and he spread rumors in town about the family's financial difficulties, hoping to damage their reputation and force them into a position where selling was their only option. Miguel was largely unaware of these machinations, his attention focused entirely on Esperanza and her continued recovery. But he noticed the worried looks that passed between his grandfather and his mother when they thought he was not watching. He saw the stack of official-looking letters that accumulated on the kitchen table, and he heard the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he entered the room. Something was wrong, something that the adults were trying to shield him from, and the uncertainty gnawed at him like a splinter lodged beneath the skin. One evening, as he was brushing Esperanza's coat in the fading light, his grandfather joined him in the paddock. The old man leaned against the fence and watched his grandson work, his weathered face illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, content to exist together in the comfortable silence that had always characterized their relationship. But eventually, Eduardo cleared his throat and began to explain the situation, sparing no details and treating Miguel with the respect he deserved as a young man, rather than a child to be protected from harsh realities. The ranch was in trouble. The expenses of caring for Esperanza, combined with a series of unfortunate circumstances including a failed crop and an unexpected increase in property taxes, had left them in a precarious financial position. Briggs was circling like a vulture, waiting for them to stumble so he could swoop in and claim what he wanted. Eduardo did not know how they were going to survive the coming months, but he wanted Miguel to know the truth. He wanted his grandson to understand that sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, the world has a way of taking things from you. Miguel listened in silence, his hand still moving rhythmically along Esperanza's flank. And when his grandfather finished speaking, the boy looked up with those same determined eyes that had refused to accept death in the auction house sawdust. The summer heat arrived with a vengeance that year, baking the earth until cracks appeared in the pastures and the creek slowed to a trickle of its former self. The drought that had been threatening for months finally settled over Coleman County like a suffocating blanket, withering crops and straining the resources of every ranch in the region. For the Reyes family, already struggling under the weight of mounting debts and Harold Briggs's relentless pressure, the drought was a blow that seemed almost too cruel to bear. The hay they had been counting on to feed their animals through the coming months failed to materialize, and the cost of purchasing feed from other sources ate into savings that were already dangerously depleted. Miguel watched the worry lines deepen on his grandfather's face with each passing week. Eduardo had always been a pillar of strength, a man who faced every challenge with quiet dignity and unshakable resolve. But now there were moments when the old man seemed diminished, as if the weight of his responsibilities was slowly crushing him from the inside. He spent long hours in his study, poring over ledgers and making calculations that never seemed to add up to anything good. He made phone calls that left him looking older and more tired than before. And sometimes, late at night when he thought no one was watching, he would stand at the window and stare out at the land his family had worked for generations, his expression one of profound grief. The situation came to a head one afternoon when a black sedan pulled into the driveway and Harold Briggs himself stepped out. He was a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw in terms of its monetary value. He walked with the confident stride of someone who was accustomed to getting what he wanted, and when he approached the front porch where Eduardo was sitting, there was no warmth in his greeting. He had come to make a final offer, he said, one that was more than fair given the circumstances. The Reyes family could sell now and walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else, or they could wait until the bank foreclosed and lose everything. The choice, he made clear, was entirely theirs. Eduardo listened without speaking, his face revealing nothing of the turmoil he must have been feeling inside. When Briggs finished his pitch, the old man rose slowly from his chair and looked the wealthy rancher directly in the eye. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and measured, carrying the quiet authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. He told Briggs that this land was not for sale, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. He told him that there were things in this world more valuable than money, things that men like Briggs would never understand. And he told him that if he ever set foot on this property again without an invitation, he would be met with a response that would make him regret the journey. Briggs smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression that did not reach his eyes. He said that Eduardo was a fool, that sentiment had no place in business, and that within 6 months the bank would do his work for him. Then he turned and walked back to his sedan, leaving behind a silence that seemed to press down on the ranch like a physical weight. Eduardo watched him go, his shoulders slumping slightly as the sound of the engine faded into the distance. When he turned around, he found Miguel standing in the doorway, having witnessed the entire exchange. Grandfather and grandson sat together on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. For a long time, neither of them spoke, each lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. Finally, Miguel asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he first learned of their troubles. He asked if they were going to lose the ranch, lose Esperanza, lose everything they had worked so hard to protect. Eduardo placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and admitted that he did not know. He said that sometimes life presents challenges that seem impossible to overcome, and that all you can do is face them with courage and hope for the best. It was not the answer Miguel wanted, but it was the truth, and the boy appreciated his grandfather's honesty. That night, Miguel lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had happened since that fateful day at the auction. He thought about Esperanza, about the moment she had opened her eyes and looked at him for the first time, about the connection that had formed between them in an instant and had only grown stronger with each passing day. He thought about his grandfather, about the sacrifices the old man had made to give him this life, about the pride and determination that had kept this family on this land for 3 generations. And he thought about Harold Briggs, about the cold, calculating way he viewed the world, about his certainty that money could buy anything and anyone. Something hardened inside Miguel as he lay there in the darkness. He was just a boy, barely 12 years old, with no money and no power and no influence in the adult world that seemed determined to crush everything he loved. But he had something that Briggs did not have, something that could not be measured in dollars or calculated on a spreadsheet. He had a bond with a creature that had defied death itself, a connection that had proven stronger than the predictions of experts and the expectations of everyone around them. If Esperanza could survive when all hope seemed lost, then surely there was a way for them to survive this as well. The idea came to him slowly at first, a faint glimmer of possibility that grew brighter the more he examined it. He remembered the newspaper stories about Esperanza, the television stations that had wanted to interview them, the attention that their story had attracted from people near and far. He remembered the letters that had arrived at the ranch from strangers who had been moved by the tale of the miracle mare and the boy who refused to let her die. And he remembered something his teacher had said in class about the power of community, about how people could accomplish together what they could never achieve alone. By the time the first light of dawn began to seep through his window, Miguel had the beginnings of a plan. Miguel presented his idea to his grandfather over breakfast the next morning, speaking quickly and earnestly as he outlined a plan that had kept him awake through most of the night. He wanted to share their story more widely, to reach out to all those people who had sent letters and expressed interest in Esperanza's miraculous recovery. He proposed creating a fundraiser, not asking for charity but offering something in return. Visitors could come to the ranch, meet Esperanza, hear the story of her survival firsthand. Local businesses might sponsor events. The community that had watched their struggle from afar could become partners in their salvation. It was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so for a 12-year-old boy with no experience in such matters. But as Miguel spoke, something in Eduardo's eyes began to shift from skepticism to consideration to something that looked almost like hope. The old man was silent for a long moment after his grandson finished speaking. He stared into his coffee cup, as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. His weathered face creased with the weight of decades of hard-won wisdom. Finally, he looked up and met Miguel's eager gaze. He said that the plan was risky, that opening their lives to public scrutiny could bring unwanted attention and complications. He said that there was no guarantee it would work, that they might pour their remaining energy into this effort only to watch it fail. But then his expression softened, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He said that his grandson had already proven that impossible things could happen when someone refused to give up, and that perhaps it was time for the old man to learn that lesson himself. They started small, reaching out to the local newspaper that had run the original story about Esperanza. The reporter who had written that piece, a young woman named Sarah Chen, was immediately enthusiastic about a follow-up. She arrived at the ranch with a photographer the following week and spent an entire day documenting Esperanza's recovery and listening to Miguel describe the bond they had formed. The resulting article was longer and more detailed than the first, featuring beautiful photographs of the pale mare standing proud in the summer sunlight and the young boy who had become her devoted guardian. It ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, and within days the response began to pour in. Letters arrived by the dozens, then by the hundreds. People from across the state wrote to express their admiration for Miguel's determination and their support for the family's struggle. Many included small donations, $5 here, $20 there, amounts that seemed insignificant on their own, but began to accumulate into something meaningful. Local businesses reached out offering sponsorships and partnerships. A feed store in the next county volunteered to provide hay at cost for the remainder of the drought. A veterinary supply company sent boxes of supplements and medications that would have cost hundreds of dollars to purchase. The community that Eduardo had served quietly for decades was rallying around his family in their hour of need. But it was a letter from an unexpected source that would change everything. About 3 weeks after the article ran, an envelope arrived bearing a return address from Austin. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman named Eleanor Hartwell, explaining that she had read about Esperanza's story online and felt compelled to reach out. She was the founder of a nonprofit organization dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating abused and neglected horses, and she had been searching for a compelling story to anchor their upcoming fundraising campaign. She believed that Esperanza and Miguel could be that story, and she wanted to discuss a potential partnership that could benefit both parties. The phone call that followed opened doors that Miguel had never imagined existed. Eleanor's organization had connections throughout the state, relationships with wealthy donors and corporate sponsors who were always looking for worthy causes to support. She proposed featuring Esperanza in their fall fundraising gala, an event that attracted hundreds of attendees and raised significant amounts each year. In exchange for allowing their story to be shared, the organization would direct a portion of the funds raised toward helping the Reyes family weather their current crisis. It was an arrangement that seemed almost too good to be true, and Eduardo spent several sleepless nights weighing the risks and benefits before finally agreeing. The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity that transformed the quiet ranch into something resembling a minor tourist attraction. Visitors began arriving on weekends, families who had read about Esperanza and wanted to meet her in person. Miguel gave tours of the property, telling and retelling the story of that day at the auction until the words flowed as naturally as breathing. Esperanza, for her part, seemed to understand her role in these proceedings. She would stand patiently as strangers approached, allowing them to stroke her neck and take photographs, her calm demeanor winning hearts wherever she went. Dr. Whitmore joked that she had become the most famous patient he had ever treated, and he was not entirely wrong. The fundraising gala in Austin exceeded all expectations. Miguel and his grandfather attended as honored guests, uncomfortable in their borrowed suits but touched by the warmth with which they were received. A video documenting Esperanza's story played on large screens throughout the venue, and by the time the evening concluded, the organization had raised more money than any previous year. A significant portion of those funds was directed toward the Reyes family, enough to pay off their most pressing debts and establish a financial cushion that would see them through the drought and beyond. Harold Briggs, watching from the sidelines as his prey slipped through his fingers, could not understand what had happened. He had calculated every variable, considered every angle, and yet somehow this family of stubborn fools had found a way to survive. His lawyers advised him that continuing his campaign against them would only generate negative publicity, especially given the sympathetic coverage they had received. Grudgingly, reluctantly, he withdrew his pressure and turned his acquisitive eyes toward other properties. The Reyes Ranch, for now at least, was safe. But for Miguel, the greatest reward was not the money or the security or even the defeat of their enemy. It was the knowledge that he and Esperanza had touched countless lives with their story, had shown people that hope was more than just a word. 2 years passed, each season bringing its own rhythms and challenges to the Reyes Ranch. The drought eventually broke, replaced by a spring so generous with rain that the pastures seemed to explode overnight with green growth that erased all memory of the parched earth. Miguel grew taller and stronger, his voice deepening and his features sharpening as boyhood gradually gave way to adolescence. He still spent every morning with Esperanza, though his conversations with her had evolved from the constant chatter of a child to the comfortable silences of two souls who no longer needed words to communicate. She was 14 years old now, still beautiful despite the gray hairs appearing around her muzzle, still carrying herself with the quiet dignity that had captivated him from the very beginning. The fame that had descended upon them after the fundraising gala had faded somewhat, as fame always does, replaced by a quieter form of recognition that felt more sustainable. People still visited the ranch occasionally, families who had followed their story online or heard about them through the network of horse rescue organizations that Eleanor Hartwell had connected them with. Miguel had become something of an ambassador for animal welfare, speaking at schools and community events about the importance of compassion and the bonds that could form between humans and animals. He discovered that he had a gift for public speaking, an ability to connect with audiences that surprised even himself. His teachers began encouraging him to consider careers in veterinary medicine or animal advocacy, paths that would allow him to continue the work that had begun with a dying horse in an auction house sawdust. Eduardo had slowed down considerably in the past 2 years, the accumulated toll of decades of physical labor finally catching up with his aging body. His hands, once strong enough to wrestle calves and repair fences without assistance, now trembled slightly when he lifted his morning coffee. His steps, once sure and confident, had become careful and measured, as if he was constantly negotiating with a body that no longer fully obeyed his commands. Dr. Whitmore, who had become a family friend in the years since Esperanza's rescue, expressed concern about the old man's declining health and urged him to see a specialist in the city. Eduardo dismissed these suggestions with characteristic stubbornness, insisting that he had plenty of good years left and that he would spend them on his own land, doing the work he loved. The relationship between Miguel and his father had also undergone a transformation during this period. Roberto Reyes had watched from the periphery as his son accomplished things he never would have thought possible, and something in that observation had stirred feelings he had long suppressed. He began making more of an effort to be present, to participate in the life of the ranch rather than treating it as merely the place where he slept between shifts at the factory. He learned to ride, something he had never bothered with before, and on weekend afternoons he would sometimes join Miguel and Esperanza for gentle trots along the fence line. These moments were awkward at first, filled with silences that neither knew how to fill, but gradually, haltingly, a connection began to form between father and son that had been missing for most of Miguel's life. It was during one of these afternoon rides that Roberto first noticed something was wrong with Esperanza. The mare had stumbled slightly, a barely perceptible falter in her normally smooth gait that most observers would have missed entirely. But Roberto, newly attuned to the rhythms of horseback riding, felt the disruption and mentioned it to his son. Miguel, who knew every nuance of Esperanza's movement as intimately as he knew his own heartbeat, had noticed it too, but had been hoping it was nothing. The fear that gripped him in that moment was familiar and unwelcome, an echo of the terror he had felt in the auction house sawdust all those years ago. Dr. Whitmore was summoned the following day for what was supposed to be a routine checkup, but quickly became something more serious. The veterinarian spent nearly an hour examining Esperanza, his expression growing more grave with each test he performed. When he finally emerged from the barn and sat down with the family on the front porch, his words confirmed what Miguel had been dreading. Esperanza's heart, the same heart that had nearly given out at the auction, was failing again. The years of relative health had been a gift, a reprieve that had allowed her to live far longer than anyone had expected. But the underlying condition had never truly healed, and now it was reasserting itself with a vengeance that medicine could not counter. The prognosis was measured in weeks, possibly months if they were fortunate. Dr. Whitmore spoke about quality of life, about keeping her comfortable, about the difficult decisions that would need to be made as her condition deteriorated. Miguel listened without really hearing, his mind retreating to a place where these words could not reach him. He had known this day would come eventually. Horses did not live forever, and Esperanza had already defied the odds once. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were entirely different experiences, and the boy who had once refused to accept death was now being asked to prepare for its inevitable arrival. That night, Miguel sat alone in Esperanza's stall, his back against the wooden wall and her head resting in his lap, just as they had done during those desperate hours when she first came to the ranch. The mare's breathing was labored now, each inhale requiring visible effort, each exhale carrying a weight that spoke of systems struggling to perform their basic functions. But her eyes, when she looked up at him, still held that same spark of recognition and love that had sustained them both through so many challenges. He stroked her face gently, tracing the familiar contours of her features, memorizing every detail as if he could somehow preserve her through the intensity of his attention. He made her a promise that night, whispered into the darkness where only she could hear. He told her that when the time came, he would be there. He would not let her face the end alone, just as he had not let her face the beginning alone. He would hold her and comfort her and make sure that her final moments were filled with the same love that had defined their relationship from the very first day. It was the least he could do for the creature who had taught him everything he knew about hope. The weeks that followed were a study in the art of letting go while holding on with everything you have. Miguel adjusted his entire life around Esperanza's declining condition, waking multiple times each night to check on her, rushing home from school each afternoon to spend the remaining daylight hours by her side. He documented everything in a journal that his mother had given him, recording her good days and bad days, her appetite, her energy levels, the small moments of connection that still flickered between them like embers refusing to die. The journal became a kind of meditation, a way of processing the grief that was slowly building inside him, even as he continued to hope for another miracle. Esperanza, for her part, seemed to understand what was happening. There was a new gentleness in her interactions with Miguel, a patience and tenderness that suggested she was trying to comfort him as much as he was trying to comfort her. On good days, she would still walk with him to their favorite spot beneath the old oak tree, moving slowly but deliberately, as if determined to squeeze every last drop of beauty from the life she had been given. On bad days, she would lie in her stall and rest her head in his lap, her breathing shallow but steady, her eyes never leaving his face. These quiet moments became their shared language, a conversation without words that said everything that needed to be said. Eduardo visited the barn more frequently during this time, drawn by a need to support his grandson and perhaps also to confront his own relationship with mortality. The old man had known many horses in his long life, had raised them and trained them and watched them grow old and pass on. But he had never seen a bond quite like the one between Miguel and Esperanza, a connection that seemed to transcend the ordinary boundaries between species. He found himself wondering if perhaps the animals we love carry pieces of our souls with them, and if losing them means losing a part of ourselves that we can never fully recover. The crisis came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the leaves had turned golden and the air carried the first hints of approaching winter. Miguel had come home from school to find Esperanza lying on her side in the paddock, her body still and her eyes closed. For a terrible moment, he thought she was already gone. He ran to her side and fell to his knees, his hands reaching for her neck to feel for a pulse. It was there, faint and irregular, but present. She was alive, but barely. He screamed for his grandfather, his voice cracking with panic, and within minutes the household was mobilized around the fallen mare. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, having dropped everything when he received Eduardo's urgent call. His examination confirmed what everyone already feared. Esperanza's heart was giving out. The end was very near, possibly hours away, certainly no more than a day or two. He offered to administer medication that would ease her passing, a gentle release from the suffering that her failing body was inflicting upon her. It was the humane thing to do, he explained, his voice soft with compassion. There was no shame in letting go, no failure in acknowledging that some battles could not be won. Miguel listened to the veterinarian's words with a strange calmness that surprised even himself. He understood what was being offered. He understood that it came from a place of kindness and professional judgment. But he also understood something else, something that Dr. Whitmore, with all his training and experience, could not fully comprehend. Esperanza had chosen to fight once before, had found the strength to survive when every medical indicator said she should die. If she was going to go, it would be on her own terms, in her own time, with her person by her side. Miguel asked for the night. Just one more night to be with her, to say goodbye properly, to honor the bond that had defined both their lives for the past 2 years. The veterinarian hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. He glanced at Eduardo, seeking guidance from the older man who had become his friend. Eduardo met his gaze and nodded slowly, understanding what his grandson needed, even if he could not fully articulate it himself. Dr. Whitmore sighed and agreed to return in the morning. If Esperanza was still suffering, they would discuss next steps then. But tonight, she would have her boy, and her boy would have her, and whatever happened between now and sunrise would be between them alone. They moved Esperanza into the barn as the sun began to set, creating a bed of fresh straw in her favorite stall, and surrounding her with the familiar scents and sounds that had been her world for the past 2 years. Miguel's family gathered briefly to pay their respects, each taking a moment to stroke her neck and whisper words of gratitude for what she had meant to them. His mother kissed the top of his head and told him she was proud of him. His father squeezed his shoulder and said nothing, but the emotion in his eyes spoke volumes. Eduardo was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at his grandson, sitting in the straw beside the dying mare. The night stretched out before them like an ocean, vast and dark and full of unknowable depths. Miguel talked to Esperanza as he had talked to her that first day in the auction house, pouring out his heart in a stream of words that flowed without conscious thought. He told her about everything she had given him, the courage and the hope and the understanding of what it meant to truly love another being. He told her about the future he had imagined for himself, a future built on the foundation she had helped him create. He told her that he was not afraid of losing her because she would never truly be gone. She had become part of him, woven into the fabric of his soul, and that connection would endure long after her body returned to the earth. Somewhere in the deepest hours of the night, Esperanza's breathing changed. It grew shallower, more irregular, each inhale seeming to require an effort that was almost too much to bear. Miguel held her head in his lap and felt her life slipping away, felt the warmth gradually leaving her body, despite his desperate attempts to share his own heat with her. And then, with a final shuddering exhale, she was still. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Miguel had ever heard. The morning arrived without fanfare, gray light seeping through the cracks in the barn walls to find Miguel still sitting in the straw, Esperanza's head still cradled in his lap. He had not moved for hours, had not slept, had barely breathed as he held vigil over the body of his beloved companion. His legs had gone numb beneath her weight, but he did not care. Moving would mean acknowledging that it was over, that the chapter of his life that had begun in an auction house, sawdust, had finally closed. He was not ready for that acknowledgement, not yet, perhaps not ever. Eduardo found him there when he came to the barn at first light, as he had known he would. The old man did not speak. He simply sat down in the straw beside his grandson and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder, offering the silent comfort of presence that words could never match. They sat together as the light grew stronger, as the sounds of the ranch coming to life filtered through the wooden walls, as the world outside continued its relentless turning despite the profound stillness within the barn. When Miguel finally spoke, his voice was hoarse from hours of talking and crying and sitting in silence. He said that he was grateful. Grateful for the 2 years they had been given, grateful for every morning walk and every quiet evening and every moment of connection that had passed between them. He said that he understood now why his grandfather had never wanted to sell the ranch, why some things were worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. He said that Esperanza had taught him more about life and love and courage than he could ever have learned from books or teachers or any other source. And he said that he would carry her with him always, a piece of her spirit living on in everything he did and everyone he touched. Eduardo listened without interrupting, recognizing the sacred nature of what his grandson was expressing. When the boy fell silent, the old man finally spoke. He talked about the cycles of life on a ranch, about the animals that come and go and the humans who love them and lose them and learn to love again. He talked about his own losses over the years, the horses and dogs and cattle that had passed through his care and left pieces of themselves behind. And he talked about legacy, about how the creatures we love live on through the changes they make in us, the ways they shape our hearts and minds and souls into something better than we were before. The burial took place that afternoon in a quiet corner of the property, beneath a young oak tree that Eduardo had planted years ago and that had grown strong and tall in the intervening time. The whole family gathered, along with Dr. Whitmore and a few neighbors who had come to know and love Esperanza over the past 2 years. Miguel spoke briefly, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. He thanked everyone who had supported them through this journey, who had believed in the miracle when belief seemed foolish and hope seemed lost. He said that Esperanza's story was not ending today. It was continuing, transformed into something new, carried forward in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by her remarkable life. In the weeks that followed, Miguel threw himself into his schoolwork and his advocacy activities with renewed intensity. He channeled his grief into purpose, using the platform that Esperanza's story had created to raise awareness about animal welfare and the importance of giving forgotten creatures a second chance. He partnered with Eleanor Hartwell's organization to establish a scholarship fund for young people interested in veterinary medicine, named in Esperanza's honor. Applications poured in from across the state, each one a testament to the far-reaching impact of one boy's refusal to accept the impossible. The following spring, Miguel received a letter that would set the course for the rest of his life. It was an acceptance to a prestigious pre-veterinary program at a university 3 hours away, accompanied by a full scholarship that would cover his tuition and living expenses. The selection committee had been moved by his personal essay, which told the story of Esperanza from beginning to end and explained how that experience had shaped his dreams and ambitions. They saw in him the rare combination of compassion and determination that defined the best practitioners of animal medicine, and they wanted to help him develop those qualities to their fullest potential. Eduardo lived long enough to see his grandson graduate from that program with honors, though he passed away peacefully in his sleep just a few months later. Miguel inherited the ranch, as everyone had always known he would, and he transformed it into something that honored both his grandfather's legacy and Esperanza's memory. The Reyes Ranch became a sanctuary for rescued horses, a place where animals that had been abandoned or abused could find healing and hope. Young people from troubled backgrounds came to volunteer, learning the same lessons about patience and perseverance and unconditional love that Miguel had learned in that auction house sawdust so many years ago. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun was setting behind the distant hills, Miguel would walk to the oak tree where Esperanza was buried and sit in the grass beside her grave. He would tell her about his day, about the animals he had helped and the lives he had touched and the challenges he was facing. He would ask for her guidance when decisions seemed impossible and thank her for her continued presence when things went well. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the light was fading to gold, he could almost feel her standing beside him, her warm breath on his neck, and her steady heartbeat matching his own. The story of the boy who asked for 5 minutes alone with a dying horse and walked away with a miracle became a legend that spread far beyond the borders of Coleman County. Parents told it to their children as a lesson about the power of love. Teachers used it in their classrooms as an example of perseverance, and animal rescue organizations around the world pointed to it as proof that no creature is ever truly beyond saving. But for Miguel, it was simply the story of how he found his purpose, his passion, and his best friend in the most unexpected place imaginable. It was the story of Esperanza. It was the story of hope. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and leave a comment below. I would love to know what part touched you the most and where in the world you're reading from. And if you believe in the power of hope and second chances, please subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one.